Welcome to I Just Don't Know, a podcast where we try to learn something new, challenge my opinions, and hope to make the misinformed informed. I can openly say I've spoken when I did not need to, been unnecessarily controversial, and shared my misinformed opinion, thinking it was not. In this podcast, I'll try to right some wrongs and take on a new topic each episode that I think are new, but in fact I just don't know. This episode is about magic, mages, monster hunters and dragons. It is about our fascination with intrinsically detailed and imaginative fantasy worlds inspired by folklore and ancient stories that have been expertly put together by a handful of authors over the past century or so. I'm talking about the genre of fantasy in our books, films and games, in particular, The Witcher. So my assumption around the genre of fantasy is that when I was growing up, and for a long time, I would say that I never thought I really was a fan of fantasy. I think the sheer complexity of many fantasy worlds and universes was just too much to comprehend, and perhaps the sort of traditional elements of a fantasy novel is that or fantasy world is that there are no constraints. Anything is possible, whether it be magic or a type of monster or beast. There was no necessary logical explanation for what can happen in a storyline or in a world that they turn up to, the main character might come across. And so magic can be anything. It can be a curse, being a werewolf, or a spell causing something to happen, or a charm which can influence behavior, or something like that. And yes, while it is categorized in those elements, the magic is just sort of unrelentingly so diverse. It can be anything, and that's perhaps too much to comprehend when you're younger, or you're just looking for the simple story. And that's perhaps where my assumption is. I always thought fantasy was too complex. And while it is rooted in, a lot of fantasy is inspired by folklore and stories, as mentioned before, that does suggest that there is some sort of history to it or grounding to it that does give it that explanation. And that is where I think fantasy really comes to become more than just fantasy. It actually represents something bigger in a local community or a country or even an entire continent. So my assumption is that fantasy has somewhat previously been less appealing to me and arguably to the more popular mainstream. And only in the last 10 years, through a number of different series, universes, fantasy universes, that it's become more popular. And in particular, The Witcher, which I am currently watching the second season of, and I've watched the first season, and I'm playing the game. That is perhaps something that's inspired this episode, and also inspired this analysis of our opinion of fantasy and where does it play in popular culture right now, because I think it's now more popular than it has ever been because of a few key changes that we're going to look at in this podcast episode. And we're going to look at how certain elements to recent things such as The Witcher has allowed it to become ever more popular. So listen to find out, and enjoy. So there are a few mainstream fantasy universes I wanted to cover first before sort of deep diving a little bit more into The Witcher and what has inspired this podcast. So firstly, I have to start with Harry Potter. So I have to, over the last few weeks, and in particular over the Christmas time, the TV TV wasn't that great, to be honest, on some of the main channels. And I don't know if some of you might have noticed that the Harry Potter channel on Sky, I only have Sky when I go home, is that it was just Harry Potter constantly, in order, playing 24/7 pretty much. So I just found myself occasionally watching bits of each film, and you start to appreciate how good the story was and how well those films are represented. And it just shows that Harry Potter there's a reason why it is so popular. But fundamentally, it is a fantasy genre. Well, it lies under the fantasy genre. It's all about wizards and monsters and potions but you could say that I remember watching the first film, and it's like really represents and shows you in the nutshell what Hogwarts is all about. And if you read the books, it dwells a little bit longer on the different elements of Hogwarts, from the potions to the spells you have to learn, and it's perhaps where the films sort of touch on briefly just to represent what it is. But in terms of how much it focuses on magic itself, in terms of the story, that just gives it the bulk to it and the colour to it that is really important, and the vibrancy to the whole story by having magical cloaks and the Deathly Hallows and things like that. But fundamentally, everyone is obsessed with was very intrigued by the story of the Chosen One and the good versus evil of Harry Potter versus you-know-who and who's going to win. And it's very clear by the end of it, spoilers obviously, that the good win. And I'm not sure about the more recent films and what that's necessarily about, but fundamentally it's a story of good versus evil. And so Harry Potter, the books came out in the 90s, first film in 99. So you could say back then, this is my sort of theory, is that fantasy was not that popular, but it was the beginning of a movement of pushing fantasy into the mainstream, and Harry Potter was a big part of that. So the second one, and perhaps something I'm even more of a fan of, was Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings was just epic. And thinking back to myself when I was a sort of 10, 11 years old, that it was very clearly a story of good versus evil. And while there were some dodgy characters and arguments and some politics involved, like if I think about Gondor and things like that, and the elves versus the dwarves, but they don't really touch on that in terms of the films. The books, they do. I've not read the books in detail, so I can't say, but from what I understand of playing all the games and things like that and reading up on it, there are sometimes some conflicts between the elves and things like that. But fundamentally, it's a story by J.R.R. Tolkien, created 80 years ago, that has many different theories of what it represents, but you can see his inspiration from World War One, and there's a great film about it as well that's worth watching. But fundamentally, it's a clear story of good versus evil, and if anything, it's easier to understand because the evil they look very evil. They're orcs and urukai, and they're ugly, and they're magical beasts that are not necessarily traditional fantasy animals or beasts. They are Tolkien's creation and what they're called and things like that. But in terms of the focus on magic itself and fantasy, it's quite subtle, I would think. And as much as I know Gandalf is the most popular character and he's the guide and leads the way and one of the main characters, most recognizable characters for the entire sort of franchise, as you call it, his occasional use of magic can change the tide of battles, and the fighting was probably why I was actually obsessed with Lord of the Rings when I was younger. But if I think back, and for those people who know, like when he uses a bit of magic, I watched recently the end of the Two Towers when he uses the light to blind the enemy so they can charge in, and but that's quite subtle. It's just getting the sun on your side, and to blind your enemy, which is a classic battle move, to put the sun behind you, so to blind the enemy and therefore make them less effective. So it's a bit subtle and very similar to Harry Potter. It's a clear good versus evil story arc that is so much easily consumed and digested by, in particular, kids and teenagers, and that's why it was perhaps so popular. And then thirdly, I just wanted to touch on, while it's not necessarily fantasy, Star Wars is definitely sort of similar to this, and I remember being very obsessed with Star Wars just at around the same time, as the age of 10, 11, 12, and I'm sure people now who are the same age are obsessed with the newer films and the newer genres where there's more impressive CGI and things like that. But again, Star Wars arguably has an unlimited universe with aliens and galaxies and planets, but I think it's, again, not that focused on that complexity. It's more focused on good versus evil, and a focus on societal changes and ideology of peace versus destruction, and conquering versus the Sith versus the Jedi. It's very clear good versus evil story arc again, and there are bad guys that are leading that are clearly have supernatural powers, and there's sort of, well, the most recognizable is Darth Vader, and you have good ones with Luke and Anakin and all those people, Obi-Wan Kenobi. The leading characters again have supernatural powers, are wizards of some sort, or have magical powers as such. So it's all about the people with more magical powers, and it was obviously super popular in the 80s, but you can't really say it's fantasy. But I did want to touch on it because it is sort of similar, an unlimited universe but again with a clear story of good versus evil. Interestingly, though, in the more recent Star Wars films, you could say that the Jedi, the idea of the magic that they have, people become more skeptical. There's moments where they don't believe, or have never seen a Jedi ever, they say, and it's 30 years down the line, and the idea of these supernatural beings is a long distance myth now. And it's interesting that the newer films do that, because they're trying to make it more real, going the opposite way? And that perhaps goes against my idea that fantasies become more appealing, and magic and things like that. People want more real dynamics and politics. So, but then some people say this new Star Wars films are rubbish, and they're not amazing. So maybe they should have gone the other way. But then lastly, I want to touch on perhaps the biggest contributor to this movement towards fantasy becoming the mainstream and popular mainstream anyway, is of course Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, starting in 2011-10, around that time, or going until 2019. That's a long time for a TV series. Popular, some of the most popular TV series go for around that long, 5 seasons, and this was 8 seasons. Game of Thrones created a cult that you can't really compare to. It's definitely not as large as Harry Potter. You could argue it's not as big as Lord of the Rings, but because of the timing of it, there was so much more hype around Game of Thrones because of there's just easier things to spread than Lord of the Rings. I'd still say Lord of the Rings is bigger, without a doubt. But Game of Thrones was written in over the course of the 90s and around the 90s and into the noughties by George R.R. Martin, and it is clearly the gradual turning point of moving fantasy in all its forms to the mainstream. But I don't think, again, it's not a true fantasy genre in the sense that it follows things exactly to the traditional fantasies in terms of witches and mages and goblins and all the folklore rules of werewolves and things like that. A lot of it is still made up, much like Lord of the Rings. You've got the undead and ice kings, and it made us obsessed with dragons and fire and beyond the wall and the north and the south. So it touches on things that people can relate to in some way, or people can be fascinated by, but it's not traditional fantasy. It's more just a made up universe of the impending winter that's coming, the evil versus everything else, which is good. But everything else is where you could say is where it was more interesting and more like other TV shows. You could say for the first 6 to 7 seasons was more about the politics, the geopolitics of the different factions, the Game of Thrones itself, the trying to become the king, and the underdog who has nothing, the Khaleesi who's got no army, no followers, but then soon becomes the most powerful person, and then comes back to take back what they own. And you have the likable characters and the unlikable characters on both sides. So I think that was what made Game of Thrones more popular. It was not necessarily the fantasy, but the politics. And so arguably it wasn't as big a fantasy, popular fantasy series as you could, or what it looks like on the surface. It didn't do as much as you'd think it had for the fantasy genre. And I love the politics side of it, and the violence and the occasional sort of speech and incredible moments of acting, and the action. But and obviously very popular, there was the irrelevant moments of nudity and inappropriate moments that pushed the boundaries of TV and the goriness to it, and that's what made it popular. I remember about to watch season 1, and I only watched it because of Sean Bean, who I'm a huge fan of as one of my favourite actors, and unfortunately, he doesn't last very long. But you carry on watching, and it built that huge hype around it. People loved it. So the question is then, why did it stay so popular? And you could argue that in the latter seasons where it's gone down in the ratings and people didn't like it necessarily, perhaps because how they wrapped up the story, but that was where more of the fantasy came in. So again, did the fantasy put people off because that's not what is actually popular in the mainstream? Not sure, but what I want to focus on now is traditional fantasy, the fantasy where things have deep-rooted origins in folklore and long-distance stories. And we're going to touch on that by looking at The Witcher. But let's quickly just to summarise then. So arguably then, and generalising somewhat, fantasy is perhaps less easy to comprehend because there is an absence of that clear good versus evil arc. And when there isn't that clear good versus evil storyline, like in Harry Potter, like in Lord of the Rings, like in Star Wars, like you could say less so in Game of Thrones, but eventually it does become good versus evil. It becomes harder to digest. And while there are evil things and beasts and people that are inside societies and storylines, it requires perhaps a mature or general understanding of our own world before you can really appreciate the depths and details of a fantasy universe. And that's where I think what takes me on to The Witcher. And because it is so complex, so difficult to understand from the off, has a lot of depth to it straight away, it throws you in, is traditional in every sense when it comes to sort of fantasy and the different things of you would expect in these fantasy universes. It is more appreciated further once you have a better understanding of of the world itself. It doesn't rely on a very clear good versus evil story arc. So, to focus on The Witcher, then, we're going to look at that in the second part of this episode, where we're going to look at some of the background and talk about how it has brought together all of our things that we've enjoyed in terms of magic and fantasy and these different universes over the last 20-30 years, and why it's perhaps a turning point for the fantasy genre that I thought was never going to be popular. So listen to find out. So The Witcher is a series of 6 fantasy novels and 15 short stories written by a Polish author called Andrzej Sapkowski, if I pronounce that right. And it revolves around a witcher called Geralt of Rivia. And a witcher is effectively a beast hunter with some supernatural abilities. Sounds familiar to the other series we were talking about. And they battle beasts and monsters in that's what their focus is in order to make the world safe. So it's almost like a story of a guardian, and he's not necessarily in the mainstream straight away. So the author Andrzej, he wrote some more stories and this is from started in 1986, and he wrote a series of novels again in 1994, and his final installment, a prequel novel, was published in 2013, but his final installment of the main books were in 1999. And perhaps also interesting is I've got someone I work with who is Polish, and they actually know. I think her dad knew the author in Poland, and that's pretty cool. So, but apparently the books over the course of the 80s and 90s has a cult following in Poland, Central and Eastern Europe, and has now been translated into 37 languages, and has sold many copies worldwide. I first heard of The Witcher when it was converted or changed into a video game series. So you got The Witcher, The Witcher 2, Assassins of Kings, and The Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt, which I am trying to play at the moment and sort of experience and try and understand it from that sense. Has been changed into a graphic novel series as well. That I'm not sure what that one's about, but and they've sold even more copies, 50 million copies. So a comic, I think that is. So yeah, very popular cult following on that sense. But now it's more put into the mainstream in terms of it's being turned into the television series that you guys might have heard of on Netflix, and that is where it has reached that epitome of the mainstream as such. So a bit more background about The Witcher itself if you don't know about it. So the story is set on an unnamed continent which was settled thousands of years ago by the elves. When they arrived, they encountered gnomes and dwarfs and different species of things, and there was a war for the land, effectively, the elves versus dwarves, similar to, perhaps you could argue, very similar to Lord of the Rings there. And the dwarves were forced to retreat to the mountains, and the elves settled the plains and the forests. But then, more recently, 500 years ago, human colonists arrived, and they started a series of wars where overall the humans were victorious and became dominant. And the non-human races were considered as second-class citizens and were put into small ghettos and settlements. And while not necessarily confined, they were allowed to retreat to the areas of wilderness not yet claimed by humans. So again, humans are seen as the sort of the bad guys. And if you say in Lord of the Rings, they're classic. Also, Tolkien from 100 years ago says the the race of men. Push all sort of are the future, and all other races will have to leave Middle Earth. So it's a similar sort of. There's definitely a parallel there. So these other races, the halflings and dyads and werewolves and vampires, were actually created by something called the conjunction of spheres. So I think there's an idea that the elves tried to create this event to give them more strength and more to fight the humans with. But it also says here that so during the centuries preceding the stories, most of the continent's southern regions have been taken over by the Nilfgaard Empire. The north belongs to fragmented northern kingdoms, so different, so with lots of politics going on there, so it sounds familiar. And the Witcher saga takes place in the aftermath of the first major war between the Nilfgaard Empire and the northern kingdoms, with the second war beginning in the middle of the series. So that is the clear sort of the background of the story, with the main characters being Geralt of Rivia, and he's the sort of the protagonist of the series, and he travels the continent making a living hunting monsters that plague the land, caused by were created in the conjunction of spheres, where arguably the elves were trying to get a better force to push back the humans. And the story of the elves is quite an interesting one, because in the later series, and what's clear in the first series and in the games as well, is that they're treated. Elves are the the largest series, or largest sort of race that still exists in plain sight. They get treated very poorly by the humans, and there's definitely sort of parallels into metaphor as of like how a minority is dealt with in history, in real life, and rounding them up and putting them into cages and not letting them reproduce, and all these different things. So a similar story that is, you can see where the inspiration came from, given the author was the Polish. So I don't want to dwell too much on that one. The other key characters. I wanted to go back to Geralt Rivia, who's the main character. So he is linked to another character by destiny, Ciri, who I'll touch on in a second. But he's represents or embodies sort of supposedly neoliberal anti-politics. He doesn't want to get involved, but he respects everyone can do whatever they want to do, and which represents the spirit of Polish popular culture in the 90s, as they've exited the control of the USSR. So I can see what inspired the author to write this character. You then have Cirilla, who's known as the Child of Elder Blood and the Cub of Sintra, Lady of Time and Space, and the Princess of Sintra, which is a kingdom in the north, and she's Geralt's destiny and adopted daughter, and much of the plot is written around her, centered around her. So fundamentally, Ciri, as they call it, she's the princess that it's all about. And again, you could say it's about she's the chosen one. Again, parallels with Harry Potter, and this is where the story that people want to know about. You then have Yennefer Vengerberg, who is she actually appears in the shorter stories, and then eventually features in the main story. Powerful sorceress, and advisor and mother figure to Ciri and Geralt's lover. So this is where things get a bit saucy in the TV series and things like that, and that's where it gets the popular vote there. Unfortunately, that's it works every time. And then you have you have a few other key characters, but those three characters are the main ones to know. So you could say there's only three key characters to know about in this story. The rest is all about the universe itself and the inspiration of fantasy that leads the charge in understanding the different elements of The Witcher. And because there are so many stories that were written by the author and so much depth to the game, to the books as well. The games had so much material to use, and when you play the games, it's famous for having so many side quests that are actually really good, whether it's figuring out someone's a werewolf or finding out there's witches in the bog, or there's someone sort of who's been haunted by ghouls, or there's so many, or harpies, and there's just such a range of different elements to the game itself, and you see in in the series as well, they really do that in some of the episodes that could be an episode in itself. They don't really touch on the main story, but they come across a village that has a story in itself that has its own depth because of some sort of magical happenings that aren't just made up. They are based quite well on traditional things that I think do so more than any of the other TV series or series that I've talked about before, whether it's Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, or whatever. They really touch on the complexity of fantasy, in the sense, like, for example, werewolves, like silver and a silver sword and moon dust, and that will counteract them, or is it a spider that has poisonous and therefore antidotes will contradict that, and you could say Harry Potter does touch on this in the books, and you sometimes hear it in the films with the potions and how to sort of deal with some of the spells and things like that. But I think a lot of it is made up. The popular ones are clearly made up to a point to fit the story, and you can see where maybe because The Witcher was created by someone in sort of Central Europe, where folklore and these ancient stories were hugely popular, and there was not as much influence perhaps from different. I'm generalizing here. These stories were things like Dracula and vampires are long stories that have really ingrained themselves in those communities and societies, that there's an understanding of things like vampires can't deal with garlic and certain sort of, and again, things, silver swords and things like that. So overall, there's this universe that is accepted, that this is what it's about, and you don't need to add any extra in. You don't need to have wizards and wands or made up wizards in Lord of the Rings. It serves itself, and all you need is a land where there are some kingdoms with new names, and there are some similarities in terms of some politics going on, and you do have a bit of a storyline with someone with lots of power and someone seeking the power. So again, geopolitics is very popular here, very similar to why Game of Thrones is popular. But I think The Witcher is so good because of its side quests, because of its side stories. Each one has that depth to it that you don't necessarily get. There aren't many side quests or side stories in Lord of the Rings. There aren't really any side stories or side quests in Harry Potter. There are perhaps some side stories in Star Wars, but each planet's got its own issues, and Game of Thrones, there are some smaller side quests and side stories that they touch on in the TV series. But why The Witcher is perhaps taking it to the next level, because of that focus on appreciating fantasy in its true traditional self, then it becomes that. It allows it that depth to have these great side quests that don't rely on clear good versus evil, and doesn't rely on a big story arc about power and the chosen one and the end of the world that people always eat up and are very easily consumable. So that's why perhaps I think The Witcher has managed to do something different in terms of the fantasy genre in the mainstream, and it surprised me, and so yeah, summarising that. It is clear that the fantasy genre, I thought, was back in the day was brought to the fore very much definitely by the likes of Harry Potter, but it wasn't necessarily cool, as you could say. And in the noughties, you had things like World of Warcraft and the Chronicles of Narnia that were family focused. Yes, they were written in the 1950s, but you had the films from 2005, 3 films, 2005, 2008, and 2010. And I think just after that, you had the things like Elder Scrolls that was focused on a fantasy in terms of the gaming community. But magic and fantasy was not necessarily cool. It had clear cult followings. There were many book series that were created in the 90s and noughties, and but it wasn't necessarily that mainstream. It was super popular as such that it really grasps people's imagination. And while Lord of the Rings, you could say, is definitely fantasy, it's clear good versus evil story arc, again, much like Harry Potter. That's why it was perhaps so mainstream and so popular on the mainstream, and its incredible battles and revolutionary filming that they did. So it wasn't necessarily fantasy that made it super popular. And again, you could say it was still not seen as cool as such. And then more lately now, you have book series that are coming to TV because you now could say fantasy is becoming a bit cooler. So you have The Wheel of Time on Amazon that was written in the 90s and early 2000s by Robert Jordan. That's been put onto Amazon to try and compete. Would that have happened 5, 10, 15 years ago? Probably not. That's perhaps a possibility. And then you have The Shadow and Bone, which was on Netflix, I believe, or Amazon. Netflix, sorry. And that was written by Lee Bardu. She's an Israeli-American who written from 2012. So it's a different sort of, again, female perspective, because 95% of fantasy novel authors are men, if you look at it. Very different from the likes of Lord of the Rings, that was obviously written and is a bit dated in terms of Tolkien's views and the society of views back then, so that's understandable. But Shadow and Bone I watched on Netflix. It's okay. It's all about a chosen one and a good versus evil and power and politics. I wouldn't say it was amazing, but easily consumable by the sort of popular along the popular lines of the good versus evil. And then you have I would say very popular with kids in the early noughties, the Amber Spyglass and the Subtle Knife, and I've forgotten the last one, but that's by Philip Pullman, who's of course a massive author who wrote many different things. And you could say this is fantasy with the daemons or whatever you want to call them attached to each person, but that was very much for the child, and so you couldn't really say that was put into the mainstream, but you could say it's not necessarily that it wasn't the coolest of or the most popular fantasy, but you can see how it was very family focused, much like the Chronicles of Narnia. It was very family friendly as such. But overall, and I know I've gone in a sort of a roundabout way in showing this, but I think, and thinking about it now, and now I've talked through it, is that the fantasy genre has moved gradually from a sort of either within a small cult following in a smaller community, whether it's in the smaller reading community or gaming community in the noughties, or a family-focused happy-go-lucky sort of magical representation of fantasy. It's moved now in the sort of 2000, from 2000 sort of 11 till now, is in the noughties. So not the noughties. 2011 till now, it's gradually moved to become darker and more and more appealing to the mainstream because of its how it represents fantasy as such. So it's perhaps surprising. It was actually surprising, you could say, how Game of Thrones impacted popular film culture and TV series culture, because that sort of fantasy wasn't necessarily wasn't supposed to be in sort of like that. You could say it's similar, more closer to Lord of the Rings, but it didn't have that necessarily that depth that Lord of the Rings, or the traditional depth that Lord of the Rings had. So I remember I was a bit surprised that it became so popular, and the fact it obviously lasted for nearly a decade showed that the popular culture did want something like that. But in particular, I think it appealed because it was darker, and unlike Harry Potter and unlike all the other sort of more sort of family-focused idea of magic in the noughties and before, that magic requires some sort of give or sacrifice in Game of Thrones, and now in The Witcher, people have to sacrifice something in order to be able to use these supernatural powers, and that's where it taps in a little bit more into the genre of being a thriller or almost a horror and an action crime adventure. And The Witcher, I think, epitomizes this more than any of the other series in the last 10 years, whether it's the Wheel of Time series that's come out and Shadow and Bone or Game of Thrones. The Witcher is where it really taps into this perfect multi-genre, you could say, of thriller and horror and action crime adventure, as I said. So fundamentally then, there's always been a fascination and hunger for fantasy in all its forms, whether it be traditional in stories shared around the campfire, or it's family-friendly Chronicles of Narnia written in the 50s, and teen pop with Shadow and Bone and romances and things like that. But definitely, and now, and what has helped it get to the fore is by having that slightly darker side, that adventure side that has depth to the story, that allows it to be more than just fantasy. And you could say fantasy is supposed to be defined as different from science fiction, so Star Wars and the likes, and horror, because it doesn't have those macabre themes and any real scientific elements to it. It might have a little bit of an overlap, but it tries to remove those, and that's what makes it fantasy. But I think now it's overlapped so much, and the overlap is so much greater, because there is definitely elements of science and trying to figure out how to create something or how to counteract something, and dealing with darker, scary monsters and things that are out of your control, and things could happen that are unexpected, has been a delight for arguably the mainstream and mainly for Netflix viewers, because this has been perfectly represented in The Witcher. And that's why I think it's a great series. I've enjoyed talking slightly differently in this episode about sort of popular TV series. So I hope you've enjoyed it as well. Definitely watch everything I've talked about. Definitely watch The Witcher, play the games, enjoy something, because I've learned that I shouldn't have doubted the fantasy genre, because actually I think I always liked it, and it's pretty darn good. Thanks everyone.